32 years ago yesterday, I was sentenced to death for a crime I didn't commit.
You were wrongly imprisoned and you've lost your life. It's the only one you're going to have.
Las condenas cerradas son un problema a nivel mundial. Hay personas inocentes condenadas, lamentablemente, en todo el mundo.
Through the work of the projects in Latin America, they freed 35 innocent people from prison.
Want dit kan en mag dus niet gebeuren.
There's an entire network of innocence projects, just like us in the United States, all around the globe.
Our project in the Netherlands was able to exonerate in the last 50 years 7 convicted persons, which served in total more than 40 years long imprisonment.
I know what it is to be behind bars for the crime we did not commit.
Rechterlijke dwalingen komen overal ter wereld voor. En we zien ook dat er telkens dezelfde onderliggende factoren een rol spelen. Dus heel vaak gaat het om valse bekentenissen, ooggetuigenverklaringen. En dat is eigenlijk iets heel universeels. Dus dat zien we in de Amerikaanse data. We zien het nu dus ook in Europese data. En ik denk dus ook dat we daar iets aan moeten doen met z'n allen.
Es ist immens schwer, eine Wiederaufnahme erfolgreich zu bestreiten, allein aufgrund der doch so erheblichen Konsequenzen, die ein Fehlurteil für den oder die Betroffenen mit sich bringt.
Ja, ich bin erleichtert, dass endlich mal die Wahrheit ans Licht gekommen ist.
Ich freue mich auf Neuanfang, dass ich die Freiheit schnuppern kann.
台湾冤狱平反协会自2012年成立。我做呀。 2012年至今，台湾冤狱平反协会已经成功地平反了14起冤错案。哭的人被判有罪，被判有罪，没有人是自由人，没有人是自由人。
It is an international issue. Wrongful convictions are basically the same in every angle of the world.
冤罪は世界共通の問題です。
Keiko Aoki has been fighting to clear her name for more than 20 years.
Innocence Movement är nu global och vi är en del av den. Den finns överallt eftersom problemet finns överallt. Being in prison, you don't have possibilities. It's impossible for you to reach out. The only persons you are allowed to have contacts with is your lawyer and the family members. Esa Teittinen, he was convicted for a murder that he did not commit based on an erroneous autopsy report and a lying witness. It was later proved that the person who had died natural causes, so it wasn't a crime at all. During his time in prison, Esa was denied to give his mother a last call before she died. She died believing that her only son didn't care about her. He was released 2018. First thing Esa did was to go to his mother's grave, bringing her flowers and asking her to forgive him that he wasn't able to say goodbye.
Io al momento dell'arresto nel 96 avevo 2 figli, uno di 45 giorni e uno di 2 anni e mezzo. Non si crea soltanto sofferenza alla persona che è stata condannata e che si trova in carcere da innocente, ma si crea sofferenza, dolore, un trauma ai figli e tutta la famiglia, madre, padre, moglie, e questo non dovrebbe accadere.
Wrongful convictions are caused by human factors, and humans are the same everywhere. Every system, regardless of the exact procedures, uses the same types of evidence. Forensics, eyewitness identification, interrogations to get confessions. Eyewitnesses are mistaken for the same reasons, whether they see a crime in Shanghai or they see a crime in Norway.
You're not alone. You're not alone. It's a global issue. For example, Mr. Necesani, convicted of a murder, the basic evidence was a recognition The police officer came to the victim, took out the photo album, and started showing the photos. Do you see him here? No. Do you see him here? No. He started pointing. I ask you again, do you see him here? Still pointing towards the paper. She pointed at his picture. And that was the basis for his conviction.
Oriktiga domfällelser borde inte förekomma, men eftersom de förekommer så bör samhället i stort bidra till att lösa dem.
Natomiast jeżeli chodzi o prawo międzynarodowe, to istnieje luka. Istnieje luka w prawie międzynarodowym, jeżeli chodzi o właśnie problem niesłusznych skazań.
As we've become this global community, one of the things we've realized is that international law really needs to step up and fill what we call the innocence gap.
Human rights law is incredibly comprehensive. A lot of thought has been put into it. This seems like the kind of gap that was really unintentional, so closely related to existing rights that it seemed like it should have been there all along.
The need for an international human right to prove your innocence post-conviction, and most importantly, to have a viable process in place to do that.
We think there is a role for international human rights law in particular to bolster this innocence movement.
If we want to really step up the innocence movement across the globe, the fastest way to do that and the fairest way to do that is through convincing the UN that they need to start speaking on these issues.
Governments, even if on other topics they're somewhat resistant, this tends to be an area where they're at least open to having a conversation. The idea would be to try to bring the two communities together and come up with a path forward that allows us to identify what should be the next steps.
Justin Brooks of the California Innocence Project and I were both invited to participate by Zoom on a United Nations panel about wrongful convictions. This was followed up by a conference in Switzerland. We've had the attention of the United Nations, the opportunity over 2 days to speak with special rapporteurs, members of the Human Rights Committee, members of the Human Rights Council, key people who we've been attempting to present our case to over the past couple years. All these efforts of trying to get the ear of the UN have started paying off. We've had some fruits of that in the past year. In 2023, we had a decision from the United Nations Human Rights Committee. A person who had significant evidence of innocence in prison in Kazakhstan filed a complaint with the United Nations against Kazakhstan because Kazakhstan refused to look at the new evidence, evaluate it, and exonerate him and free him. And the Human Rights Committee issued a decision, just like a court might here in the United States, that said, this is a human right. It's part of the right to a fair trial. Well, here we have a UN, United Nations body, the Human Rights Committee, for the first time recognizing the right to exoneration through new evidence of innocence as a universal human right. The UN has expressly stated that there's a right to DNA testing for post-conviction, and there's a right to present evidence in order to prove innocence. That was a big breakthrough.
תנועת החפות והמאבק לחשיפה של הרשעות שווא הוא מאבק גלובלי. אנחנו חלק מתנועה גלובלית.
If the United Nations starts speaking in terms of the right for someone in prison who claims they're innocent to have DNA testing done, the right to come back to court and have your conviction overturned when there's new evidence of innocence, right to compensation after exoneration. When the UN starts speaking in terms of these things, they become recognized and adopted as universal human rights. There are people in prison around the world that had no relief before that can now either go to their domestic courts and point to the UN statements and say, this is part of international law. You have to give me the right to freedom.
Las condenas erróneas no están solo en España, sino que están en todo el mundo. Ven y únete al movimiento Innocence.
L'erreur judiciaire est un problème qui nous concerne tous, dans tous les pays, y compris en Europe, et il est temps qu'un droit fondamental, garanti sur le plan international, permette de meilleurs mécanismes pour faire valoir les demandes en révision.
We realize that this is a long battle. It's something we have to do, though.